friends, this is Rick, and we're at your seat at the table, and what we're going to talk about is, as of 3025 in the Battletech universe, the 5 core problems that all inner-sphere houses seem to be facing. And we're going to start with the deep-seated beliefs of their particular manifest destiny and their belief that they need to or have the right to lead a reborn Star League. All right. Their core beliefs. It all started off officially upon Kerensky's conquering a Terra from Amorous. Each house lord at that time believed that or decided that they had a legal right, claim, or military strength to the title of the First Lord. And it began with Minoru Kurita declared himself First Lord first, which led to every other House Lord doing the same thing. Jennifer Steiner made her declaration, backed it up by invading Draconis Combine. John Davion may have had the strongest, quote, legal claim, as he had been designated regent for the Richard Cameron's daughter Amanda. In any case, he believed that he and his heirs were the rightful lords of a new Star League and joined the First Succession War with as much enthusiasm as everyone else. By and large, this attitude continues all its way through the second and third wars. If the fourth one, might argue, was because Hans Davion was fed up with House Liao and decided to put an end to their backstabbing ways. Even then, each lord in 3025 still believed it was their house's manifest destiny to reunite the sphere and begin a new golden age. Ironically, the clan's invasion was the catalyst of seeing the Star League reborn after a fashion, to be led by Theodore Kurita, the ancestor of Minero. Sadly, the new Star League would be a short one. But let's take that for a moment and take into consideration that it was through political pressures, economic pressures, badgering, veiled threat of force that Cameron was able to put together the Star League in the first place. All these independent nation states, these great houses, were, prior to the Star League, their own people and their own philosophy, their own manifest destiny. And so through a lot of effort and or skullduggery, the Star League is formed. And this holds solid for a better part of 300 years. The big part of this is that these houses found themselves subjected to the will and or influence of, quote, the sixth house at that time, the House Cameron, who were the first lords of the Star League. And if it wasn't for a lot of the reunification wars and other petty wars going on against the periphery, allowing somewhat of an avenue of outflow for some of these house lords, I imagine the Star League would have had a lot more problems than what it did. The quote golden age, in part, was because it was backed and supported by a never-ending conflict beyond the borders of the inner sphere. And this is just my opinion, of course. The leading up parts to that. So when Amorous stages his coup, and General Kerensky is forced to march on Terra to reclaim the Star League from Amorous, the great houses, more or less, the house lords, more or less, saw this as an opportunity. Most of them sat on their laurels. They chose to be neutral after a fashion, even though they were obligated by treaty and by rote to support General Kerensky and this effort to reclaim the Star League throne from the usurper, as other people saw it. I mean, I am not an Amorous fan by any means. His tactics and skullduggery to take this basically highly destructive coup is not outside the realm of all the other house lords. Any one of those house lords could easily attempted something of this nature. Maybe not in the same method, because each house lord and each house has its own methodology of doing things, approaches to stuff, and so on and so forth, but every one of them thought about it at one time or another. Especially when the young Richard Cameron, under very bad advice, started becoming much more dictatorial and his demands on the various houses that made up the Star League. At some point, he was never truly impressed on his young mind that House Camera was not the beat all to end all of the inner sphere, and that the Star League was a league and not a kingdom or an empire. So he was not, by just because he was entitled to be the title of First Lord, and he was first among many, not the only Lord, period. And this, of course, is part of the hubris thing, but there's also this underlying manifest destiny that the House Cameron believed in, it that was their right to rule the inner sphere, and by any means necessary. And if that meant basically subjugating through politics, economic, and veiled threats, then so be it. That's how it played out. So when each one of these House Lords saw the writing on the wall, Kerensky's March on Terror, Amherst's eventual fall, it was a undeniable conclusion that Amherst would not retain the throne, that his time was numbered. Actually, as soon as Kerensky decided that's the way it was going to roll, the Star League military was in motion, and it was potent and powerful, and every House Lord knew it was just inevitable. So instead of jumping on the bandwagon, as often politicians, quote, will do, they all started more or less preparing for the aftermath of the removal of Amherst. They started beefing up their militaries. They started investing in their own technology to improve their combat abilities, etc., etc. The writing was on the wall. Started stockpiling weapons. But on another angle, they had been doing this for 300 plus years during the entire quote golden age. Their militaries were in check. They were limited by treaty and decree. They were obligated to support the Star League military in various forms, in which they did, which limited those resources going into their own militaries. So once the March on Terror begins, the Star League military finds itself not necessarily cut off from revenue and supplies, because they were no longer getting access to the Star League coffers in general, but they also had no legal recourse to force the House Lords into supporting them in a much more robust manner than what they were able to achieve through the threat of force, veiled force, and politicking by Kerensky, or General Kerensky's handpicked whatever. So they start this itch. They have been in check and subjected to or an agreement that they call the Star League. But each one of them starts smelling the possibility of personal freedom, of political freedom, of their own resumption of long denied manifest destiny for their particular creeds, beliefs, and cultures. Because if you think about it, that's one of the things that the Star League never quite overcame or suppressed. And we see this much later in after the Exodus and the initial failure of the SDL forces to establish a society that led to a second Exodus and then eventually the clans, is that territorialism is deep. That manifest destiny for individual groups is very, very deep in the psyche, and we still see that is quite true in humans, period. That is part of our nature, and it's a very detrimental part to a truly global community, or in this case, an interstellar community. The Star League was never able to superpose or replace all those nationalities, those independent beliefs and dogmas that make the Draconis Combine and the Federated Sons and the Compelling Confederation and the Free Worlds League and the Larian Commonwealth who and what they are, and what makes them stand apart from each other. This is part and partial something that continues to the modern era of Battletech, and it is the bread of the substance of what this entire world that we all love and operate in. So this is a big problem. As long as every individual House Lord, and by fiat, it's the house's populations believe in a certain unalienable truth that is their particular house lord or their particular house and their particular nation that should be in charge of everybody else. That there should always be this goal, this underlying goal to unite all humanity under one creed, under one flag that drives a lot of what goes on and continues to go on in the problems that we see. Then this takes us to the next problem that's grossly hampering inner sphere growth and expansion and a true renaissance of what could have been. One of the things is lost tech, this slow decline, this reversal of fortune and ingenuity and design that was part of the golden age of the Star League. So aside from the billions of lives lost, the first succession war nearly sent the houses into the Stone Age. Judicious use of warships, nukes obliterated or irradiated major cities, centers of learning, research facilities, the very industries needed to manufacture all the quote high tech that inner sphere needs to thrive, not to survive, to thrive. The massive drain each succession war caused in the various houses' economies, as well as the significant lack of foresight by house leaders throughout the wars, has further depressed technology and the knowledge needed to create it, let alone maintain it. Each house allowed the general education to slide, as did planetary leadership, to the point where the majority of citizens of the sphere are barely educated. This goes doubly so for higher education. This failure has further exacerbated the situation. It is suppressed creative thinking, oftentimes on purpose, at great cost to ingenuity and advancement. If a people cannot understand how technology is made or how functions in essence, how can it envision ways to innovate and build upon it? Think about that. It holds so much true in our own era today. We take so many things for granted that there are entire generations that absolutely have no idea how they would function without access to the internet or without a cell phone in their hand. I mean, as a commercial driver, I drive all over central Iowa, and I am constantly annoyed and angry and worried when I look down and I see countless people with their faces half buried in their cell phones while they're hurtling down the interstate or hurtling through town at high rates of speed. It's just a wonder we don't see far more accidents than we do, right? But this obsession, this need for technology also breeds technology. Without good education, without a solid educated base of people, the growth of technology is going to be limited and in some cases halted altogether. There has been this brief moment here in the last year or two in America where there's a certain growing number of people who don't believe science. They don't want to believe science. They're tired of this, whatever it is, and or they're willfully ignorant. It's one thing to be ignorant because you're ignorant. It's another thing to be playing ignorant when you really know what the stakes are. At the bottom core of things, you're playing with fire and you're going to get burned. And the sad part is you're likely to burn down the whole neighborhood too, and everybody else with you, right? And nobody cares, or not enough people care personally, and that's just my personal opinion on certain things. At the official beginning of our Battletech universe, circa 3025, we began to see a few leaders and small groups take steps to reverse the slide, even introducing new technology and development. We see the New Avalon Institute of Science, and we see the recovery of the Helm Memory Corps. We see organizations and groups like Team Bonsai and others who are really striving towards recapturing the lost technology of the greater era, and then even advancing beyond that. And this problem with technology is a core element to the game universe. And for the most part, and I say this with love, there are a lot of players out there who don't grasp that. They don't understand why things should be, are kind of why we do things in the way the Battletech universe is set up. You know, in the early days, a lot of people, we were obsessed with salvage. It's important to know that you just didn't keep destroying your mechs because you couldn't get replacements. Well, what fun is that? Oh, I don't want to have a game like that. Well, that's your prerogative, but that's not true to the spirit of our game and our universe. And the fact that not all technology is even. So we see that gross separation when the clans invade, and the clan technology is advanced even beyond Star League cutting edge because in certain fields. But we see that also within the clans. The clans scientist case concentrates on certain very specific narrow fields of advancement, and everything else is secondary or trinary or not at all. And so there's limits, self-imposed, because of that mindset. So when we talk about the great houses, and I've already done videos on all five of the major houses, and we'll start doing some of the periphery powers in the near future, is this core concept that the bulk of humanity is poorly educated and has very limited access to advanced education beyond middle school. You know, just take a moment and think about how different society would be today if only 1% of the population actually completed high school, and a small percentage of that 1% go through basic college. It's almost a given that in our economy today in this quote Western countries, that you need to have at least a basic college education in some form to get yourself a better paying job. And it doesn't always hold true. I mean, there's a lot of skilled trades out there, but you know what? Those skilled trades are still education. You get educated, whether it's on the job training by mentors or in classroom education by teachers, is still education. And we see that problem all across the sphere. And some houses much more impacted by this than others. The Great Federated Sons, ironically, is often compared to America, and it should, in some aspects you can make that comparison, but and there's other aspects amongst that also holds true. This I don't know, education to the point of being so expensive that your graduates spend a good first quarter of their life working career trying to repay off these debts. They're already put behind. It's like you need the education, you need the higher diploma, the higher piece of paper to get a better paying job, but then you're going to pay for that in great detail for some time. And the it's almost intentional. Well, it is intentional in some aspects. It's freaking greed, but it's also limits how many people can really strive for much better things. I mean, I can think of a number of people who really have had their horizons limited because of school debt and the inability to pursue even higher education at the point of I got to support a family and I need to pay my debt back. All right, it is what it is. So we look at how this loss of technology feeds into the manifest destiny mindset and this I need to conquer everybody, I need to control everybody. And the first succession war, at the end of the first succession war, beginning of the second succession war, the House leaders started to realize that they literally were on the verge of a technological collapse, that they are really playing, that they've not only played with fire and nuclear fire, but they damn near killed off any aspect of any kind of progression. You're not going to rule over a galaxy full of dead worlds, especially if you have no way to reach them, right? So that brings us to my third point. One of the third big issues facing all the house lords of the inner sphere as of 3025 is this never-ending conflict. This boots on the ground. Where do we put our boots next? It's our right. It's our divine right. It's our destiny to rule the inner sphere, to control this never-ending need, now propagated and pushed by needing to acquire resources and manufacturing capabilities and boosting the economy, all more reasons to have conflict. From the fall of the Starleague, the Great House has been engaged in a seemingly ceaseless era of conflict. This refusal or inability to come to terms with the war, that war, raid, and counter-raid is not the answer. Not only are the houses more or less balanced, they simply cannot embrace that peace that has a purpose other than to be served as a breather or a moment to restock your logistics pool and rest and repair your troops for the next big go. And I have this phrase I've liked to use for years when my own game system that I created with my players was called, "Where goes the house lord goes the house." So if the house lord leads by example or leads by executive decision or law, then the house is going to follow. So if you have an aggressive, look at how the Draconis Combine. The bulk of the Kharidan population, of the Combine population, are not Bushido wielding samurai. That is a very small elite. The bulk of them, though, follow a lot of the same dogmas and credos that were impressed upon them by those samurai elite. So their mindset is quite driven. House Liao, another great example. But that same thing holds true for all the other houses as well. This is the mindset. So if the house lord in the leading house is in flux or in confusion or at conflict with itself, then that breeds and carries over to the general population. Conflict with inside a conflict with inside a conflict. You name one great house that isn't beset with internal problems is almost as grave as external problems. They all have them. Some layers are different than others, but the threats are still there, always there. There's a real possibility of fragmentation. These great houses are held together by a number of things, but there's a thin line or thin ties. And if they broke up into many smaller houses, how much more conflict would there be? The conflict would not necessarily decrease as much as people like certain leadership and certain minor houses believe it is their manifest destiny to be the rulers of the great house and over the inner sphere, and then some of them believe it's their destiny to rule independently of anybody else and to be truly an independent power. And toward the end of the Fourth Succession War and the 20-year law after that, before the clans arrived, we see a bit of this. We see the breakup and the dissolution of a number of, quote, smaller territories, smaller houses that are eventually reclaimed by the greater houses or controlled by them indirectly. It's how the periphery houses manage to survive and thrive is in the same mindset. So what I'm saying is, for my own would-be game, minor lords, politicians, leaders of the masses tend to emulate their house lords. This causes more internal strife and hate and discontent than most people realize, because they scheme, plot, and put plans into motion to gain something at the expense of their rivals. It goes that their followers will try to do the same thing. We are human by nature. We are copycats by nature. As children, we learn to do by watching our elders do. And we often take on a lot of their philosophical and political, religious views, etc., etc. So conflict costs both sides far more than peace does. Most houses' economic struggles because the never-ending conflict drains funds, resources, and mind power, not to mention manpower, that would otherwise be used to grow the house and its in essence the lives of its citizens. If your house is constantly in conflict, if you're constantly at battle, whether internally or externally or both, think of all the effort and time and wasted resources that go into this that could have been applied to improving everybody's standing, improving everybody's life, to advance humanity as a whole and technology and so on and so forth. So this discontent, this hate, discontent, destruction is in part never going to see us, the inner sphere, becoming a united, truly united entity ever. And this holds true, as we all know, because the game's advanced a better part of 100 years and nothing's changed. Everything's changed, and lots of things have changed, and yet nothing's changed. Nothing of significance. This leads me to my point, my fourth point. This decline in technology, this wanton destruction of education and denial of innovation and constant conflict and lack of foresight has grossly inhibited FTL travel, the ability for mankind to travel the stars, whether it's to bring supplies, needed food and water, and raw resources from one neighboring planet to another, or allowing the well-to-do to take various trips and journeys to various places to see things, to maintaining the defense or being aggressively proactive about going after your neighbors. If you don't have the jump capacity to haul everything around in the numbers that's really desired, that's a problem. And as a 3025, it is a critical problem that every house lord and pretty much every citizen of half-ass education understands that jump ships should be inviolate. Nobody should attack a jump ship. Nobody should destroy a jump ship. And you most definitely do not go after the handful of remaining facilities that can produce new ones. Because if you go by game canon, there's only roughly 2,000 jump ships available, period, amongst the 5 inner sphere houses. And I'm going to do another video that's going to focus on a rant about that too, because that is absolutely absurd. It's just not sustainable, period. But if a mere dozen, if production is a mere dozen annually, what is then a minute production of the height of the star league? Then the inner sphere at the end of the star league must have been able to produce hundreds, if not thousands, of jump-capable starships. In fact, that by 3025, it is universally agreed that the further damaging or destroying of what's left is, at the least, undesirable. Mankind has lost mankind has both feet in the interstellar grave, and the end seems inevitable unless somehow they overcome this, that they somehow change that. Consider how much depends on those suggested 2,000 odd jump ships that are left to the sphere. Houses cannot exist without jump-capable transports. That's a period. That's just absolute truth. Each individual planet would truly be on its own at that point, and many would fail because they're dependent on an interstellar connectability. Many worlds would be uninhabitable, their populations doomed to horrible ends. Places that are not capable of supporting themselves food or water. Just think of how horrific the end for that population would be, and how many worlds that would be repeated over and over and over again once starship capability is completely lost. Even to the point where it's reduced to the point where there's just not viable. You simply cannot bring enough food and water. If you have a population on a planet that's, let's say, in the millions, and that planet is food poor. Well, maybe it's resource rich, but it's food poor. It does not have the means or the ability or capability of producing enough food to support itself, period. How many shipping tons per year of foodstuffs would that require to support 10 million people? How much food does average person consume in a year? Consume and waste. If you speculate that at a ton, if everybody consumes a ton of food and water a year, and I'm not sure if that's accurate, and all that food has to come from another planet outside your solar system. So you need to be able to move 10 million tons just of food, 10 million tons. So when we look at a jump ship or a drop ship that can carry 5,000 tons. How many drop ships is that going to take to move that food in 1 year? How many? And you have to do that every year. So these ships are constantly in pressed for that purpose. And then your jump ships carry how many of these drop ships? How many drop? Do the math. I suppose I should have sat down and done the math on that, but it just doesn't hold up to the 2,000 that the Lord suggests. I really have a sticking point on it. Yeah, I know. You know what? Tough. Economics already stretched thin. Collapsed resources needed by worlds in production stop coming. So did food and water deliveries. The bottom of the hole is reached, leaving the remains of humanity once more landlocked to specific worlds. I have to ask, how is it that collectively has humanity allowed things to reach this point, and how do they fix it? How do you reverse this interstellar decline? Because at no point in the game canon to date, to even now, has this ever been truly addressed? We see a renaissance after the Fourth Succession War, and definitely a much bigger renaissance in technology after the arrival of the clans for a short window. But there's no real mention of a starship construction boom, aside from all the great houses scrambling to reintroduce warships into the equation. There's no massive uptick in shipyard production, let alone production of shipyards. We're not fixing the terrible problem. This is the 800-pound gorilla in the room that everybody's ignoring or trying to ignore because A, it's not fun, B, it's too confusing, C, who gives a damn, etc. I care. I find it quite fascinating. Between the conflict, short-sightedness, and straight economics, the houses have all but abandoned the idea of exploration. A lack of sufficient transportation and education has suppressed growth. In a galaxy barely touched by humanity, to squabble over the same turf for centuries is frankly insane. We're seeing that in our own world today. There is no place left there's no unexplored frontier that's really exploitable for us. We either have to develop and pursue aquatic exploration and development, which inevitably will happen. As the land becomes more untainable, we will have to exploit the other 90 or 70% of the planet's surface. And of course, space, the other planets and what's beyond our system, which we are trying to do in very snail-like fashion. But that is the inevitable. So for the inner sphere, this dearth on education and innovation and scientific development and resource and putting the resources needed into improving this stuff is imperative, and yet this never-ending concept of conflict driven by these misguided quote manifest destinies has, and this decline in technology is all served to bring humanity to a brink of a true dark age. True dark age. So when I first heard the concept of the dark age era coming up for a Battletech universe, which is come and gone in our real world scenario, but from 3025 perspective, when I was looking forward and I heard that stuff, one of my first thoughts was, so the starship capacity to jump and move things around becomes imperiled, and a true dark age becomes in part. So the way the HPG network is affected, sure, that feeds into it too. But there's a lot of unanswered, unsatisfying questions that came up from that era. Is for another video, I believe. So we end up with 5 great houses, an innumerable amount of smaller houses, all in conflict, each one pursuing their own version of a manifest destiny with this desire and need somehow to come out on top, to impose their will and their philosophy and their cultural beliefs on everybody else in this resurrected Star League. Meanwhile, technology is in the dumps and then starts to see a renaissance, and education starts to see a little bit of an uptick, and yet conflict rages and continues to rage. And even when it slows down and everybody thinks it's about to peter out, it's still border skirmish and raid after raid and petty stuff, in part because we lack the resources, the means, the ability, and the drive to expand in other directions, to realize that we're fighting over and over again over the same turf for a limited amount of resources. And granted, the amount of star systems within the inner sphere that have resources is vast. Vast. So when we talk about a house having inhabited planets at 300 and 400 habited planets, my argument is that there's probably 2 or 3 times as many as those that are not, quote, habited, i.e., they're mining outposts and research facilities and military outposts and bush backwater villages, that exist because somehow the world is not viable on a large enough scale to be heavily populated. And so if you don't have a population level of excess amount of people, it's not worth, politically speaking, claiming it as a settled planet. But I imagine there are tens of thousands of planets and planetoids and moons throughout the inner sphere that have pocket little villages and communities of 100,000 people or less that don't qualify. Meanwhile, the houses don't expand beyond their borders into the greater galaxy as a whole, in part because the lack of jump ships. The lack of jump ships prevent them from expanding and taking those gambles. It also prevents them from having an effective transportation system to bring those new resources, to bring the people to the new planets and bring their new resources from those planets back to the inner sphere. Ignore the periphery states, because while there are quite a few of them and they're some of significant power, they're not all encompassing. There's no one periphery state that cuts off no great house 100% from expanding into the great beyond those borders. Not currently, not in the past, not now. So the one last final detriment to peace and exploration and a truly new golden age in the inner sphere as of 3025 is ComStar. ComStar. Perhaps the single unifying thing across the sphere is the ability to communicate between worlds. This remnant of the Star League, this neutral, quote, neutral force that provides communications to all, that establishes a universal monetary system trusted by all. Perhaps the single damning thing across the sphere is this seemingly benevolent, pseudo-religious entity that has a secret plan to save humanity and bring about a new Star League with itself in charge. Of my 4 points so far, the hand of ComStar has been up to its shoulders, further encouraging various house leaders over the years of their own individual superiority and manifest destiny, subtly urging and nudging and giving covert nudges to spark conflict and distrust, dousing smoldering embers with rocket fuel to inflame the hearts and minds of the inner sphere. ComStar's secret plan is to deny knowledge and stifle innovation, so that the sphere reaches a point where their only savior is to embrace and accept ComStar as their leaders. One has to wonder how much things might have gone differently had ComStar never existed, or had in truth maintained its claim to neutrality. Think about that for a minute. If ComStar actually held true to its dogma on what it's going to do and what it's going to support and how it's supposed to be, quote, truly, truly neutral, just how much that lack of truth has impacted the conflict of the inner sphere. Grant you, the great houses have a lot to account for, a lot to be blamed for. Before the first succession war was blatantly the houses unleashing this long kept up need to dominate everybody else. They use the excuse of trying to reunite the Star League with themselves as the head, as an opportunity to basically go to war and to play with all those expensive, destructive toys that they have been hoarding and piling up just for this day. But after that, ever since that, any time that there seemed to be uh, the wars were winding down, that great houses were starting to come to their senses, that maybe a different mindset was going to set in and take over, something instigates somebody to do something dumb or savvy in their way of thinking and reignites conflict and destruction. And in doing so, while all this is raging and going on, this same unknown hand is manipulating the technology development, going out of their way to stifle, i.e., even assassinate uh, scientific innovation and or researching into lost tech. The same entity, the same shadow hand that's playing its long Game of Thrones mindset is secretly amassed a huge plethora of wealth, great wealth of knowledge and technology. So when we talk about lost tech in the greater BattleTech universe, this lost tech is lost to the houses and the people of the great houses, but not to humanity completely. And this is because ComStar is a custodian of all this knowledge. They have maintained it in secret for the majority of the succession wars. Now there may be some lost tech, there might be some lost knowledge that ComStar didn't have, wasn't purview to, didn't have access to, and that's touched on in a couple points the succession wars lore, that during the first succession wars, such wanton destruction had occurred, and it took its toll because so many corporations, so many universities maintained certain elements of advanced technology and understanding and knowledge as their holy grail. They kept it very close to the breast, and so they would produce things, but not share how that production process was. So that when you destroy the corporate office of a massive industrial chain that produces, I don't know, jump ships, perhaps you're taking out their database at the same time, and you don't care about that because either it didn't occur to you that maybe they're the only one that has access to certain elements within the manufacturing chain for these things, or collectively, if you destroy enough of them, when they talk about, once again, in the dropship lore, that there are things that go from boom to nothing to everything to these guys, where do we end up, right? We talk about this lack of ability and knowledge and education, this lost, this slow decline from the epic of the Golden Age, with the exception of elements within the clans and ComStar. So ComStar missed the boat in one way, or they chose not to pursue it. They would have had the means, the ability, the knowledge to resurrect, if not build new jump shipyards to produce jump ships to first sell. They could have been producing jump ships in large quantities and selling them to all comers. They could be producing the components needed to manufacture and keep those jump ships that we do have running in peak form. They chose not to pursue this mindset, or it never occurred to them to try. It's just like we never hear of any of the great houses building brand new shipyards because for a long time they don't have the means. So when we return that concept to lost tech, a lot of the technology, including battle mechs and certain types of weapons, computer systems, things like this, are manufactured in Starlink era factories that were in large part fully automated or semi-automated. So the machines are programmed to produce these things. And long after the technicians and the engineers who maintain these things pass away, and nobody understands how to reproduce the machines that produce the technology. So the technology is terribly hamstrung. The exception of these fine fellows here, who potentially could have lifted the inner sphere out of that technological dark age hundreds of years ago. But it wasn't advantageous to their grand scheme, their plan. And it's not until the end of the initial clan invasion that ComStar unwittingly shows its shadowy hand, and much to the detriment of everybody, including ComStar. So there you have my, let's call it a diatribe, or my belief in the 5 key crucial issues as of 3025. I think later down the road, and this we're talking sometime down the road, and assuming I remember to do it, I will do a follow-up to this video with taking into account many changes that will occur and have occurred depending on which side of the timeline you're sitting on. But as of 3055, a lot of this changes, and some parts of it never changes. But that's just my opinion. And this is Rick, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. All right, let's see if I can find my exit. Oh, there we go.